Hello and welcome to video 2 in the OWASP Top 10 series. And in this video I want to look at authentication and session management. Now this is quite a big topic. It covers lots of different things and it's slightly different in every different framework. So we can only really cover the top level ideas of what authentication and session management are all about and the ways in which they can be insecure if they are not used correctly. So what are we talking about? Well, an authentication or session management system needs to be implemented correctly, otherwise an attacker can impersonate someone else and gain access to data or functionality that they shouldn't have access to. So that's probably quite obvious. An obvious example would be a non-administrative user gaining administrator privileges, or even somebody who isn't even a registered user being able to impersonate a registered user and gain access to something. The other issue with authentication session management is that they both involve cookies at some level, and cookies are a very easy way for an attacker to try and impersonate someone else. Cookies are very easy to modify, and I'll show you that in a second. And if the authentication system itself is bypassed or the permissions elevated, then the developer has not coded it correctly. So even if the authentication system itself is okay, if it's been misused and miscoded, then there are still problems that can allow an attacker to do any one of a number of things in reality. Now, this is really only common on older applications and reasonably common on applications that have been written from scratch. So where somebody has invented their own authentication or session management, then probably it's going to be vulnerable to attack. Modern featured frameworks, your Drupals, your WordPresses, all of the rest of it, usually include a session or authentication system, and usually it's pretty secure by design. But of course there's always a danger someone has extended some functionality or somebody's replaced part of it. There's always a danger that you break something, and especially one of the problems that we find in development is if you think you understand something, then you might make changes that are actually going to break it just because you think you know what you're doing. So it's always quite hard to know whether what you're going to do is going to have a detrimental effect, and especially if the built-in system doesn't do what you need to do in a certain way, you might feel the need to change it and you might end up breaking it. So we're going to look at a couple of ways in which this might manifest itself. So what I've done here is we're going to look at session to begin with, and again the examples here in .NET, but they're very similar for other frameworks and languages. And the idea of a session is that you're able to track an individual user through their journey across your site. So a very obvious example is I've got a shopping basket and I want to store things that people want to buy in the shopping basket. Now, if the user has logged in and I know who they are, I have the ability to actually save that information directly away into the database if I wish to, and record it against the user. The issue we have is if the user has not logged in, and in the case of most shopping sites they're not required to log in until they check out, then you need some way of tracking that same visitor as they come back, and to know when they come back that it's the same person. And guess what? We use session, and session uses cookies. So what does that look like? Well, I have done something very clunky, very quick and dirty, just to kind of demonstrate what's happening. So I'm going to say that if the user visits the about page, I'm going to store some information into session. Now, it doesn't really matter what the key and value are, so I could have shopping cart equals, I don't know, new bike or something like that. It doesn't really matter what we're going to do. Let's say when I visit this page, I'm going to add a new bike to my shopping cart. So by default, .NET will store the session in proc, that means in memory, inside IIS. So the actual contents of the session are not going to be visible. But let's go to this site. I'm going in Chrome instead of Opera just because I've got a cookie editor plugin in Opera. So let's go home just to make sure we're starting up in the right place and it's all working. So we have one cookie. We can ignore this for the time being. This is part of .NET. It's to do with cross-site request forgeries, and that's going to be another video, so let's not worry about that for now. But if I click on the About page, then it's going to put that stuff in session. Now, even though that's stored in memory in IIS, obviously the browser needs to be able to track its own session, because otherwise when this browser goes back to the server's not going to be able to know that this is the same person who just visited the About page. So when we visit the About page, it stores the data, that new bike stuff, it stores that in session on the server, but it gives me a session ID and it stores it in a cookie. So what that means is if I go to any other pages, you notice that session ID is still there. It gets persisted. Whatever pages I go to, that's all going to be the same. Even if I go back to the About page, I've already got a session. It's not going to do anything magic. And this key is just a way for the server to look up anything that I've put into session, and there could be more than one thing. There could be hundreds of things. Clearly there are performance issues with putting too much in session, but we won't worry about that for now. So what's the problem here? Well, the initial problem with session, and the problem you can find on older systems or systems that have been written maybe by hand, is firstly, what happens if this ID number is guessable? So let's say I'm a completely different person, I'm an attacker, and I come along to this site. And what happens if I go here and I click on my cookie editor and I say, wow, actually, I don't want this cookie ID, I want this cookie ID instead. And I click go. I can turn it off now and I can go and visit back again. Now, you'll notice what's interesting is what .NET does is if it gets an ID that it doesn't recognize, it just creates a new session and will allow you to carry on using it. So that's fine. But what happens is if this number is guessable, so let's say it was only 4 digits long, well, I could guess somebody else's session ID very easily, and okay, in this case, all that's going to do is I'm going to inherit their shopping basket. It's not going to be a big deal. But of course, in some cases, in some applications, it would be a big deal, because if you're using session to store private data, or if you're using session to gain access to certain resources, then somebody being able to guess that resource ID is going to present a problem. So that's number one problem, is having guessable IDs. Now, in the case of .NET, you can see that ID is long enough. It's not guessable. There are, millions and millions and millions of combinations of that. And in reality, most sessions are only going to last, let's say, up to 20 minutes or something. So you haven't got a lot of time to guess an ID before it's going to be recycled anyway. Another problem we have is where this session ID could potentially be read by JavaScript. So this is just a cookie, it's just a text file, and it's accessible to script by default. And what that might mean is if somebody managed to hack my web page and put some script in there, they could potentially read this session ID and send it to me, the attacker, and I can then visit the same site, copy and paste the session ID, and again, that's another way of obtaining a session ID and impersonating someone else. So what do? Well, you see this HTTP tick box. That's actually enabled again in .NET by default, but for a normal cookie, that isn't ticked. If that's not ticked, it means that JavaScript can access it. So you need to make sure that your session ID has that ticked. And what that means is the only way that cookie can be accessed is by HTTP when you make a page request. So JavaScript can't read it. In most cases, you probably don't want JavaScript to read it. So that's a security measure. Another security measure is this secure flag. So if your site is only accessible over HTTPS, which for most sites nowadays should probably be true, then again you can set the secure flag on there. I think you can actually do it in web config on, which I've not got open, on .NET. So if I go down to session blah blah blah, and I think probably somewhere here, cookie name, cookie list, config source, no, it's either there, or I think you can set it in, I think it does it automatically if you access it with HTTPS. I think that flag gets ticked. But what that will do, if it is ticked, is it will say this cookie is only available over HTTPS. it won't be sent from the server over HTTP. So again, you've kind of got a few security mechanisms. They should work by default in your framework, but you do need to test that they're doing that correctly. So that's session. Another danger with session is in some systems it will put the session into cookies, and that cookie will come back to the client, which again might not be a problem because you're kind of thinking, well, it's their shopping cart and their bike, so they already know they've put it in there. But again, the danger might be that either the person can change stuff in the cookie. So again, I've showed you that you can click on any of these cookies, you can edit them, and you can change the value to whatever you want. So if you want the anti-XSRF token, you can change it there. If you want to change the session ID or any other cookie, they can be changed. So there is that danger. The other danger is you might be exposing private information. So the person's password, for instance, don't ever put that in the session. It doesn't need to be in the session. It can come from the database, be checked in the database, whatever. So you need to be a bit careful about using cookies for session as well. Like I say, .NET, any good framework should by default put the session somewhere useful. In this case, it goes into memory. You've got other options in here. You can put it in a SQL server or a state service shared session, so you can put them all on the same server. If you've got a web server farm, obviously you can turn it off if you don't use it, that's fine. You can create your own custom provider. It's interesting that it doesn't look like you can use cookies in .NET, which is interesting and very useful. So that's kind of one side of session. So let's extend this a bit more and show what happens generally with cookies. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to extend what happens when you go into the About page. I'm going to do that. I'm going to build it. And then if I go back here, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set a cookie when I go into About. And you see it's called isAdmin, and it has a value of 0. And what I've done is I've actually added a menu item up here for bank accounts that's only visible if you are admin. Now, you would be probably surprised how common this sort of functionality is. Usually what happens is somebody logs in and it says, oh, you're Luke, I know you're admin, so I'm going to put that in a cookie so that then I know whether to show or hide the menu items. So if we go back to home now, nothing much is going to happen, that's all fine. But guess what? If I click on this and I edit it, and I say actually 1, I am admin, and then I close that again. Now what happens when I go home again, that cookie's posted back. Oh look, I've got access to the bank accounts page. So this kind of stuff, very scary. You know, you shouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that. The authentication or authorization is probably available in your framework with a built-in mechanism, and you shouldn't be manually doing things like this. Notice also that it doesn't have the HTTP, so that's even worse. That would allow an attacker to have put script into a page and actually change the token on someone else's account, maybe call something in bank accounts, and if the server looked in the logs, they would see this user as having done it because it was done with their cookie being set to 1, even though it was an attacker that did it on their behalf. So again, we can go back in, we can actually set HTTP only on the flag, we can set, you know, a number of other things. Now if we go to About and it drops that cookie, hopefully it's going to tick the HTTP flag. So, you know, there's another thing. Again, you see it very often. One of the difficulties we have is there's lots of different ways in which this can be broken and accessed. So unless you're using a built-in system, the only real way you're going to know whether it's fixed is by having somebody pen test it and stuff like that. So okay, here's a question. And how do we store stuff securely in a cookie? Now, if we think about authentication, we have a similar problem in that we want to track this user who, okay, they come in here, they log in, they put in their username, they put in their password, and they log in. Now the problem is, once I've logged in and control has come back to the browser, when I then revisit another page, how does it know that I'm the same person? It's a bit like the session tracking. I need to track the user, but I obviously can't just have a cookie that says I'm Luke, because I could change that to be any other user, and then when I go back and give that cookie to the server, then I get to bypass all the security controls. So there is a way to store stuff securely, and that's what happens here with this, which is the authentication cookie. And actually, if we actually look at the value for that, we'll see this big long piece of base 64 encoded data. And what that actually is, it's the expiration date, it's the username, it's a whole load of things. Then it's encrypted using a machine key that only the server has access to. And then it's signed as well so that they know it's not tampered with. At least I think it's signed anyway. So when that gets posted back to the server then has the ability to decrypt that information, know that it's Luke, know whether the authentication has expired yet, and then allow you to log into those pages, because otherwise each time I visit it I'm going to have to authenticate again. So again, I'm going backwards and going forwards, and it's posting that back. So I'm just going to try actually what happens if I change just some of those, I don't know, B2 or something like that. I don't really know. Let's just change it. So now if I go back here, notice that it's somehow detected that the data's been changed, so it's not logged me in as Luke. So I've just changed a couple of bits. The signing of that data has failed when it decrypted it, so it knows that there's something wrong, and so you can't actually edit that to try and make it read something useful. And because it's encrypted, you can't change it to another different encrypted piece of data, because only the server knows what the encryption key is. In fact, it's automatically generated unless you want to specify it manually, which you can do. So authentication session, it's all in cookies. You've got to make sure it's done properly. And I guess the last thing just to mention is that there's sometimes confusion between the overlap of session ID and the authentication. So in some ways this is tracking a specific user. In some ways this is tracking a user. So the two things aren't the same. In actual fact, as soon as you first appear at the site, most cases you end up with a session ID, and then what happens when you log in, what should happen is your session should be regenerated, and that's just to say, now that I know who you are, I can track you more effectively with a clean session. And also when you log out, it does depend whether you want to clear the session on login. It depends how your site's set up. If you need to log in right at the beginning of accessing your site, then you can clear the session. If you're logging in at the end, like on a shopping site, you don't want to clear the session because you're going to lose your shopping basket. However, when you log out, again, you clear the session because you're saying the only reason you're logging out is probably because you're about to leave. I'm going to clear everything out of the session, and then there's no danger of anybody kind of hijacking that stuff. So there's certain complications there. There are certain complications to do with expiration, because session tends to have a rolling expiry. As you access it, it keeps getting extended, but authentication, certainly in .NET, doesn't. So if you want it to be 20 minutes, it'll be 20 minutes. At the end of the 20 minutes, you'll be logged out. So you sometimes have the conflict between the two. The only real answer to that is to learn about how it works and to work out what it means for your application. So the ideal, really, use a modern framework. The mechanism has seen enough public use and testing. You can probably search Google very specifically, is session secure in .NET, is authentication secure in .NET, whatever. You should find out the answers to that fairly easily. If you can't rewrite your application, it might be possible to copy in something from a modern framework. Let's say you've got an older PHP application. You might be able to take something out of a modern PHP application, just the authentication part, just the session management part. You don't really know if that's going to work. It might be better than what you've got there, but again, you're possibly not going to know. Be particularly mindful of password hashing. Because password hashing is often a target for attackers. This is to do with breaking authentication just by brute force. If somebody gets hold of your database and is able to see a very weak password hashing algorithm like MD5, a lack of salt, those kinds of things, then probably they're going to be able to brute force that quite easily, and that's another way in which authentication is broken. I've already mentioned HTTP only. Probably you want that turned on all the time. If you can have SSL across your whole site, do it. and set the secure flag as well, and that will stop man-in-the-middle attacks from being able to pull that data. But ultimately, really, the only kind of secure way is to pay people to perform penetration testing and or code review to actually test the session handling and to look for problems on your behalf. Yes, that's going to cost you a couple of £1,000, a couple of $1,000, whatever. But at the end of the day, that's an awful lot cheaper than the fallout you're going to have if your site gets hacked and all of your users find out. That's potentially lost business, it's potentially fines, it's potentially money you're going to have to spend after the fact trying to tidy up everything afterwards. So really, for most commercial operations, there's not really an excuse for lacking that pen testing and code review to actually test that that works. So hopefully that's been reasonably useful. I know it's a complicated subject. I know it's not easy to get your head around. I guess the too long didn't read answer is use a modern framework, do your homework, do your testing, and at least you're going to have a bit more assurance that what you've got is not hackable, at least in a very easy way. So any questions or comments, please put them below the comments in the video. Our next video, as you can see, is about cross-site scripting, another big issue in web applications. Again, usually fairly easy to protect from, but we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.